Before we jump into any of the business, entrepreneurial things, anything like that, outside of the business whatsoever, just tell us about who you are as a person.
Okay. Well, that's a hard question. Who am I as a person? I started my career as a lawyer, and figured out reasonably early on in the game that I enjoyed being on the other side of the table a lot more. So I haven't done that for quite a while. Uh, but I've been gradually went from law into real estate, and from real estate ended up through a variety of circumstances we can go into later if you want, in the seed stage venture capital business, basically providing financing to startup companies. And sort of as a byproduct of that, I ended up starting a number of companies, some of them quite successful, others less so, but I think I only had one real loser in the 10 or 11 that I started. Uh, and I've been doing that for the last, probably 30 years now. Absolutely love it because it gives me a chance to work with young entrepreneurs that have a brilliant idea, or they think it's a brilliant idea anyway, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, and build from that new businesses. And to me, there's just nothing more exciting because you start with, in essence, with nothing, and if you do it right, and if you're a little bit lucky, you can end up with a company that can change its little piece of the world. Sometimes you want to change the whole world. That usually doesn't happen, but you can often make a major difference. And I've had the good fortune to have that occur on more than one occasion, and it's enormously gratifying.
For sure. So, obviously, decades of experience. If you wouldn't mind, give us the short of the long story of these 10 or 11 businesses that you've had your hand in founding or co-founding.
Well, I don't know that I want to go through the whole list of 10 or 11, but I'll give you the highlights. Probably the earliest was a company that we founded. I founded with a partner, and I've often done this started with partners. It works better for me, at least. That had an interesting history. We thought we had developed a new device that would greatly improve the accuracy of LASIK procedures, because it would give a better measurement of the eye. And we went a long way down that road, and then we finally realized that, yep, sure enough, it did give a better measurement, but nobody cared because LASIK was good enough. And that's one of the lessons I learned, is that sometimes just being better is not enough. You have to make significant changes and structural changes. We went through a couple of financial near-death experiences, ended up changing the model twice. Once we decided we could measure children's eyes for a condition called amblyopia, which is a major problem for young kids. Found that market was really too small and we couldn't finance the company. And then we hit upon, through the aid of a very fine ocular physician, what was really the right application, and that was we discovered that we could enable a physician during the operating procedure, a physician who was doing cataract surgery. And as you may or may not know, in cataract surgery, you remove the what's called the lens, which is a soft, translucent part of the eye that has become clouded, and you replace it with basically I'll call it plastic. It isn't really. It's some sort of a composite material that then gives vision back. The problem was getting accurate vision. And in the old way, you had a series of algorithms and you tried to measure things which didn't work very well because you had this clouded lens in the way. And that's how people ended up with the sort of Coke bottle type glasses. We figured out a way to put a device on the physician's microscope that would enable him to very accurately tell exactly what lens, what size, how to adjust for astigmatism. And we were getting vision by the time we ultimately sold the company. We were getting vision correction that was very, very close to that of LASIK as a byproduct of conventional cataract surgery. So it was really very gratifying for me because I have, over my life, had enough eye problems to realize just how life-changing that small procedure can be. So we ultimately started the company with few friends and investors, and ultimately sold it many rounds of VC financing later for about $350 million. So it was very exciting. Then I started a biotech company, more or less at the same time. Some friends of mine and I got to talking about stem cells and the potential for stem cells to be used to treat type 1 diabetes. And everybody got excited. We had a wonderful scientist who had emigrated from the USSR. And we started down that road with the biotech company. Again, life intervened, and we found that we probably didn't have an effective treatment for diabetes, but we did have a way of creating a new class of stem cells that operated much the way of what are called embryonic stem cells, except we didn't have to use a fertilized embryo. So we took we thought we took all of them. Some people still managed to find objections, but we took basically all the real objections away from those who were concerned for religious or other reasons with whether or not using embryonic stem cells was in effect killing a human being in utero. And that we ended up taking that company public. We got caught in the downturn of 2008. We lost financing that had been promised to us, et cetera. And then in January, my CEO, who was a brilliant guy, came out of Merck, died of a heart attack. And I found myself running the company, which I never intended to do. I'm great at starting companies. I hate running companies. It's just my temperament. But I did. I ran it for several years. We were at one point just months away from financial bankruptcy, basically. I went to Paris, met an investor from Russia in Paris, and with a translator that I dug up in Paris that could translate English into Russian, which was an interesting adventure all its own. The eve of a major French holiday, finding a translator that could do all of that. But that we did, and got financing from the investor. Ultimately, we took the company from trading at 15 cents a share to over $2 a share. And then through a series of disagreements between the new shareholder who had become our largest single shareholder and had the ability to essentially to veto or not whatever we wanted to do, I finally concluded that he really wanted to run the company and that I couldn't run the company unless he would cooperate. So I stepped aside from that. But I was very proud of what we did with it because we created a new class of stem cells and made all of the investors who put their faith in me when the stock was trading at 15 cents and we had 90 days of cash left. They all had a chance to get out with a very, very substantial profit. So I was very pleased with it. The company has gone on after I left, and it basically is operating almost like a private company now. So the investors who stayed around probably didn't have as much fun as they should have if they'd gotten out when I got out. But they had fair warning because it was all public information. So anyway, that was a great, fun adventure. Then I started several real estate companies that were in buying and selling apartment buildings. We built a 30-story high-rise. I started with some partners, built the first wind energy park in Palm Springs area, the Southern California area, and that still is operating. I sold my interest in the turbines, but I kept my interest in the land, and I still cash checks every month. So that's been almost at least 20 years now. So those are the kind you like to remember that get started and then just keep paying you for a lifetime. And there have been others, but those are probably the ones that are the most fun anyway.
Absolutely.
Excuse me. I have a question here. You started many companies. It seems like they're not connected to each other. They're in different industries. What is in common?
Well, that's a very good observation. First of all, the only thing they had in common was an idea that required some entrepreneurial skill and some fundraising skill. And I'm one of those people who is, I guess the old phrase was, jack of all trades, master of none. But I'm enormously curious about new business models. I don't try to get myself involved any more than absolutely necessary in any of the operation. I look for the best people and back the best people and brought in partners. So the only common denominator was that each of them, in its own way, had a chance to make a major change in the way some business or some medical procedure was done. So we looked for places where we could make a significant change in structure rather than just incremental improvements. And that's probably the one common thread.
I assume that all those ideas came to you, right? The people who have the ideas, who had the ideas came to you, not it's not your original idea. So when you talk to them, what do you look from the people?
Well, you're quite right. I have discovered over the years that in my particular case, I'm very, very good, or I think I'm very good at taking an idea that someone brings to me, figuring out whether it has legs, as they say in the show business world, and helping make it a reality. I can't claim much credit for the original idea for any of these businesses. I had partners or associates or people who simply brought them to me. So as to what I look for, I tend to look for several things. One, if it's an idea being brought to me by a would-be entrepreneur, uh, I look at whether or not he or she has both enthusiasm and skin in the game. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they've written big checks, but they've put some portion of their life on hold to pursue this so that they're not going to quit the first time we have a road bump. I don't think I've ever started or had a successful business that didn't at some point have a what I call a near-death experience. Nothing runs that smoothly, or if it does, I've missed them all. But I think for the most part, they don't. So I want a founder or a co-partner who is not going to jump and run the first time we have some storms. And then the other is I want, if it's some technology involved, I want to be sure that the technology, if it's successful, often it's not completely developed when we start, but that if it's successful, it will make a fundamental change in some business or industry or science. Because I've learned that it's very, very hard to be successful starting a new business if you're just doing it a little bit better. Because, everybody's looking for perfect, but perfect is the enemy of the good. And if there's an existing process that's serving the market adequately, it's usually a fool's errand to try to just make something else that's a little bit better. Now, in retailing and some other models that can happen. But in general, it's just a lot easier if you come up with something that's actually going to make a sea change in the industry.
Okay, so basically you're looking at the people and the technology. Both are.
They're both absolutely critical. There's a third factor, which is a little more intangible, and that is it an idea that can be commercialized? Because ultimately, almost everything is going to require capital, and the key to raising capital is, can I go to an investor and say, look, if you put $100,000 or $1 million or whatever the amount is into this, you have a reasonable chance in 3 to 5 years of getting 5 to 10 times your money back.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they might as well invest in the S&P 500. So I have to look at it and say, is there a real market here? Is there something that we can do? And is there a way we can do it and structure it that investors who put their money with us will get a reward? And so that you have to factor that in pretty early in any new idea. And I've turned down a number of things that were brought to me just because I said, this is great, but it doesn't scale. It's always going to be a small business. And so I personally, I mean, there are people who will help out small businesses like that, and more power to them. I admire them. It doesn't fit my business model, and it doesn't stir my juices as much as the chance to make a company that'll end up being anywhere from 100 million to $1 billion or more.
That makes lots of sense. I think those 3 points can serve as guidelines for anyone who wants to get into VC business.
They're certainly a good starting point, because without those 3 ingredients, you're really trying to swim up a waterfall.
Okay.
Definitely. So early on, if we can turn back the clocks a little bit, were there any big breakthrough moments for you when you, I guess, realized that life wasn't going to be going down that kind of normal path that most people will follow in the work world?
Well, yes, there were. There were there was one definitive moment for me when I was still practicing law, because I'd worked very hard to get a law degree and get into a major law firm, and certainly had a career path outlined for me. And I was sitting around a table. We'd worked all day long. One of the more senior partners in the law firm and I, and then lawyers for the other side. We were doing a registration statement for a public company. And at the end of the day, the company and the firm that was doing the underwriting turned to us, the lawyers, and said, "Well, that was really good. Can we have a new draft of the work tomorrow morning at 9, and we'll start again?" And off they went to have dinner at Chasen's, and we ordered sandwiches. And I said to myself, you know what? There's something wrong with this. I don't mind doing this when I'm a young 20-something-year-old, but my partner that I was working for is in his 30s or 40s. I don't want to be the guy eating sandwiches in my 30s and 40s. I don't care how much they pay me for it. And so I set about to get on the other side of the table, and ended up taking a significant pay cut and significant risk to do that. But it ultimately worked and set me on the path that I'm on now and have been, and it was a great decision. So from a personal point of view, that was a critical moment when there used to be I think I put this analogy in the book I wrote called Dream Toolbox, but there used to be a Wide World of Sports had a sports program on Saturday, and their opening not credits, but their opening montage was, I think it was a skier, might have been a tobogganer, coming down a ski run and losing control and flying head over heels into a snowbank. And the tagline was, "Wide World of Sports, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat." And I realized that with conventional jobs, you're either working for a paycheck, or in the case of a lawyer, you're measuring out your life in coffee spoons, as Eliot once said in a poem. And there's never the chance for a real thrill of victory. The expectation is don't screw up. And I wanted something more than that. So that was, at the personal level, that was a game changer for me as well.
Definitely. So you mentioned risk as well. If you wouldn't mind, we jump into some of the potentially low points or riskier ventures that you've gone out on. How do you go about mitigating that risk when you're talking millions, if not potentially billions?
Well, you can't eliminate all risk in a company that is a startup. It's just built into the game. The venture capital community, if they're honest, will tell you that probably 80% of the companies they back don't make it. And I don't have exact numbers, but it's certainly up in that general range. Maybe it's even higher. So they're banking on the hope that the one you're doing will be the big payoff company. So risk is always part of it. And one of the things that I wrote about was that I think one of the biggest deterrents to a successful entrepreneur is not failure, but the fear of failure. We can think of all the things that might go wrong. Actually, we seldom think of the ones that actually go wrong, but that's another story. But and we talk ourselves out of it. And when we look at it, at least when I've looked at it and I've seen through my eyes and through others, the fear of failure is usually a fear of looking foolish with your friends, of things that aren't really significant. So one of the drills that I have tried to teach in Dream Toolbox and elsewhere is take a look at the absolute worst thing that could happen if this business didn't make it, and say, could I survive that? Could I survive it financially, emotionally? Would my marriage survive? Whatever the relevant factors are. And if the answer is, yeah, it would really, really be unpleasant, but yes, I could survive that and go on, then say, okay, that's the worst that can happen. Let's do it. And stop worrying about it. Stop thinking about it. And I found that drill is enormously freeing and helpful. And sometimes you look at one and say, if this thing failed, it'd be too much. It'd wreck a marriage or whatever it would do. And I've told people sometimes that came to me, I said, look, your life as you know it won't survive if you try to do this. So I recommend you not do it, or you find some partners to do it with you so that you're not taking as big a risk. So that's a very critical view, and that has to do with fear of failure more than failure. Then you go ahead, and if it fails, the business failed, but you didn't. You're not a failure. The business was. But it also gives you great power when you hit the dark spots and what I call the near-death experiences, to say, no, there ought to be a solution to this. Let's figure out how to find it.
Absolutely. So while I got you talking about it and those near-death experiences, are there any that really stand out over the years as something you wish you could have gone back and done differently, or a moment where you went, man, if I had, gone this route instead, it could have been the big one?
Um, I don't, in a sense, because I think in each case we did the most we could do with what we had available. And so you can look back and say, maybe if we'd done it differently, for example, in the stem cell company, maybe if I'd been able to find a finance source when we were basically broke, that did not have an interest in ultimately taking control of the company, we might have had a more successful public company. But we didn't. I mean, the reality was I'd gone everywhere I could think of and took the option that was available. So that I think if you've done your best, looking back and doing woulda, shoulda, coulda is really an unproductive thing. It just hamstrings future adventures and makes you cautious when you shouldn't be cautious. So the short answer is no, I don't have any regrets. Certainly, there probably are things that we could have done differently that would have made a difference in some of the companies, but we did the best we could, and we used every resource we could find, and it just is not productive for me to regret those things.
Absolutely. And if I can continue on it just to push it just a little bit farther, during these
Push on.
moments, have you ever found yourself making a big sacrifice, or are there any sacrifices over time that have stood out that you've had to make to have something succeed?
Well, yeah, many times, and that's the other side of the coin. I mean, first of all, the very initial sacrifice that I made when I said I want to be an entrepreneur instead of a wage earner involved a couple of things. One, initially, a very substantial decrease in my salary, and number two, the risk that salary could go away, the income could go away almost overnight, because I went first to get some training. I went to work with an investment banking firm on a contract which basically said, we'll keep you as long as you're being productive, which it was no guarantee because I was stepping into a new field. So in that sense, that's certainly one of the factors that was, I had to deal with, and had to deal with both the fear of that and the reality that I was taking a significant risk. In the other example is when we had that I can think of off the top of my head is with the stem cell company, which was public at that point. When we really hit the wall, my CEO died, and all the things that I told you about had happened. I looked at it and I said, okay, I've got to write a check here. I can't ask anybody else to come in and help bail us out if I'm not willing to write a check myself. So at that time, and I didn't have that much money then, but I wrote a $500,000 check, and I said, my money's on the table. Can I talk you into coming in with me? And yes, this is very high risk, so don't do it with money you can't afford to risk. The reality was I couldn't have afforded to lose that $500,000 without a major disruption in my life. But I had to take that chance because, one, I'd looked at it, I said, I could survive it. It would just be very, very painful. And the other was, if I don't do it, the company, which I thought had enormous promise, would fail. So, and in varying degrees, of course, I've had to make those similar decisions. I've put money into companies. Almost never have I been willing to ask anyone else to put money into a company if I didn't have my own money in it. That's been my rule. Some startup entrepreneurs don't have any money to put in, but they're putting in their time, they're putting their life on hold to try to make it happen, and that's real skin in the game as well. So, but yeah, everybody at some point, everybody has to take some genuine risks. I've never known a startup that didn't involve that.
For sure. And now that I've taken you down to the kind of difficult low spot, we'll bring you back up to a high. What would you say are the biggest perks of doing what you do, or the happiest moments that you get from finding these successes?
Oh gosh, the thrill of just saying, I did that. I made it work. Um, that's one, and that's that's true across the board. The other one is that I've over the years have gotten the greatest satisfaction out of doing deals which changed other people's lives for the better. I mean, certainly increasing vision did, uh, changing the way in which people use stem cells had the potential to, and I think ultimately will. That's still a working process. Um, even something as simple as well, it wasn't simple at the time, but developing the first wind park in the Palm Springs area had the potential to change a lot of lives for the better. And you can argue about whether or not the wind turbine business is good or bad or whatever, but it made a lot of difference to a lot of people. So in every case, I've tried to do things, sometimes consciously, sometimes just because that's the way I'm wired, that had the potential to make a real difference, not just for me and the investors, but also for society in some form. Now, it's still a whole lot of fun to make money from a deal and see it take off. Uh, I was not one of the founders, but I was a very early member of the board of directors of a company called Green Dot Corporation. And it started literally in the bedroom of a friend of mine. And I remember we had board meetings around his kitchen table, and went public some years later at a $1 billion market cap, and has basically created a whole new industry. So those are exciting times, and that's changed a lot of lives. I wish I could claim to have been the founder and driving force. It was another gentleman by the name of Steve Street, who was one of the more remarkable businessmen I've ever known. But that was a lot of fun to be along on that pony ride, and to a lesser extent, I've had the same thing myself.
Absolutely. And along this path, have you discovered any secrets or tools of the trade that the general person wouldn't know about that you utilize to find these successful businesses?
Yes, I have, and I think they are the very successful entrepreneurs often use them, sometimes without being conscious of it, without sounding like a commercial. Since I wrote Dream Toolbox, I've had a number of entrepreneurs come to me who are as successful or more successful than I am and say, I read your book, and there was a chapter, such and such, and then they name the chapter, that I really hadn't thought about. And I wish I'd thought about it when I was 20 years old instead of reading it when I was 50 or 60. So there are things that are, that are a significant factor in there. The things that have worked best for me are probably a combination of the following, and I'll kind of go through them quickly, and then we can elaborate as you want. The first thing is really having a very clear vision of where you want to go. And that's both personal and business-wise, because it's enormously empowering for any individual to have in their mind a vision of what their life would be like if they were successful, whatever it is they're trying to be successful at. And someone told me this probably 50 years ago, and I embodied it, and it's paid off enormously. Take that vision and translate it into today so that you don't say, someday I will be successful, but in your subconscious mind, you're saying, I am successful now. And this is what it's like. And I don't have the new car and the new house and so on yet, but those will come because I'm already that successful person. Now, I used to, and again, it was advice I got from somebody else, but I would stand in front of a mirror and visualize that at the beginning of every day. And I felt really, really stupid doing it, I'll tell you. But then one day I realized it had worked and that I'd already achieved the early set of goals and it was time to set new ones. So visualization of success is enormously important. And that's probably one. Another that I think, then after that, you have to do the hard work and think, okay, how do I get there? What are the way stations? How do I measure success along the way? And there are techniques for that I've written about it, but so have a lot of other people. There's another that I have found increasingly valuable that I think most people don't do. And that is every business comes with major obstacles, barriers, whatever you want to call it. And I've learned that by changing in my mind and the way I talk about it, one thing, changing things from being a barrier or an obstacle to being a puzzle makes all the difference in the world. And the reason is we are wired to solve puzzles. The definition of a puzzle includes that it has a solution. So that if I face some insurmountable problem and I say, oh my God, it's a train coming right down the tunnel and I'm stuck, I'm not likely to be very creative about it. But if I say, this is a puzzle. I know there's a solution. I just have to find a way to find the solution and then implement it. It changes the whole mindset. And I think it's one of the most powerful tools that is underutilized and unrecognized that I've ever run across. And I've used it time and time again when things look really, really bleak. So there probably are others, but those pop into my head.
For sure.
Yeah.
And one of our favorite questions to ask during these interviews, obviously, you have those keys to success, those kind of trade secrets that let you mitigate risk and find the success. But is there anything at this point that keeps you up at night or things that you worry about on a daily basis when it comes to doing these types of business deals?
Well, the part answer is no. I very seldom am up at night worrying about the business and so on. Now, that's not always. There have been times when there have been a specific problem that I was in the middle of trying to solve, a puzzle, if you will, that I was trying to solve. And I would wake up in the middle of the night, with my brain running in circles. So that happens, but very seldom because I think when you start worrying in the middle of the night about stuff, you haven't done the early homework. You haven't done that job of saying, okay, what's the worst that could happen and can I deal with it? So you worry about stuff that you shouldn't be worrying about. You should have already thought about. Second, you can't solve stuff in the middle of the night. Actually, you can. Sometimes I've had some, the best insights I've had in the middle of the night. And hopefully I either remember them or woke up enough to write them down. And that's happened many times. But in general, just worrying about stuff only makes you tired and unproductive and negative in your thoughts. So I try pretty hard not to let those things intrude into my personal psyche and worry about it. Worry, doubt and worry and fear and guilt are all negative emotions. And the more we can keep them out of our lives, the better off we are.
Definitely. So if we can transition a little bit, we've talked about the past plenty, talked about the future a little bit now. As an entrepreneur and a serial entrepreneur at that, is there anything in the future coming up or already starting to reach market that you're really excited about or you'd love to get your hands on?
My experience has been the things that are already visible to me out there in the market. Somebody else has already started and is way ahead of me. So what I'm looking for are the things that are not yet obvious, and those can come in many ways. I recently became an investor in a company. It's not a startup anymore. I invested through some friends, but it's very exciting because they have, I believe, a way to, I won't say cure, but to take any of the existing chemotherapies that are used in cancer and make them way, way more effective. And the reality is, based on the data we have, in many cases, cure cancers that had been where the physicians had given them up as incurable and a death sentence. And that is enormously exciting to me, and I think we'll see that. I've also invested, although I'm not a principal, in in 3 or 4 other companies that have varying ways of approaching, uh, particularly cancer, but other disease forms. And that to me is an exciting area, and I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what can be done medically. Uh, there are things going on with AI that will affect the medical world. I read in this morning's newspaper, for example, about a new AI technique. I think it was developed by Google that has greatly improved the accuracy, or looks like as if it has greatly improved the accuracy of mammograms. And that could be life-saving. I know my former wife probably would have been alive had the technology of mammograms been able to detect the breast cancer that she had uh, earlier on than it did before it had gone into her liver and elsewhere. So all of these things excite me a lot, particularly in the medical science and those areas. I will confess that I am less adept and therefore not as knowledgeable about some of the things in high tech that are going on, electronic technology, than I probably should be. But I think we all gravitate to the things that interest us most, and that's usually a good marker for success anyway. It's hard to be successful, even in a burgeoning field, if it's not something that grabs your fantasy and your attention. So I tend to focus where I can get excited.
For sure. And pushing all the way to the end of the road if we can. Do you ever see yourself stopping or getting out of being an entrepreneur whatsoever at any point?
Not really. As I've grown older, I've made a promise to myself that I won't start any more new companies. I will continue to finance them and advise them and be involved. Whether I'll keep that promise, I wouldn't want to commit myself to. It's a personal promise. But I can't see stopping because, frankly, it's so darn much fun. I've flunked retirement several times in the sense of really trying to turn it off. And what I've discovered is that just about the time I'm getting all excited to go play a round of golf or go play tennis or something like that, somebody will call me up with a new idea or a new concept, and I'll cancel the golf and I'll cancel the tennis because nothing is really more fun or more exciting than dealing with a new idea that has great promise. That's my personal excitement about it. But I think it's true of everybody that I know, because being an entrepreneur means you are no longer a slave to somebody's timetable, except your own, and accept the timetable that's imposed by whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. And you have an enormous amount of freedom. So there's no reason to retire as long as it's fun. When it stops being fun, quit. If you've done it right, you'll have made enough money to quit on. And one of the things that I try to talk to every young person that I talk to about is, look, do what you do, build equity, build assets that will work for you forever. And then you have a choice. You can work till the day you drop, or you can retire at 50 or 40. Doesn't matter. You can do what you want to do with your life. So that's my philosophy. But no, personally, I can't see me retiring.
Definitely.
It's just too much fun.
For sure. And on the note of those up and coming entrepreneurs, what would you say would be your key pieces of advice for somebody really wanting to get something off the ground?
One, look at it and determine, does this really excite me? Is this something I truly want to do and that I'm willing to make sacrifices to have happen? Because if there's no excitement behind it, you're not going to make it. You're going to quit the first time it gets tough, and it will get tough. So there has to be a level of commitment. Call it excitement, call it commitment. Pick your word, I don't care. But if that's not there, I would say keep your day job. If that is there, then you go on to do the analysis and say, okay, what does it take to make this work? Can we make it work? What happens to us or our investors? Because there's always capital involved. If we are successful or if we aren't. And then you do all of the normal entrepreneurial things. But the starting point is you've got to you got to believe. You got to see yourself succeeding at this, see yourself changing the world. And if you can do that, you've got a pretty good chance of succeeding. Now, I also couple that with what I call building an entrepreneurial mind. And I can't go into all of that. That's why I wrote a whole book about it. But it's a way of changing your mindset so that you look at almost everything as an opportunity rather than as a problem or as something negative. And if you develop that, it just makes it's basically as simple as changing your default mechanism in your brain from I can't to I can. And there are a lot of techniques to get there, but if you can do that, then you can pretty much do anything that you really want to do.
Absolutely. And for these people looking to get something going, do you have a favorite quote, person to look for, books? Obviously, you've written your own. That's a huge point of inspiration.
Well, I won't make it a total commercial. You know, one of the great books, and it's overlooked, but I think everybody should read it right after they finish mine, actually before, is Think and Grow Rich, which has been around for, almost a century, I guess. But it is absolutely a brilliant set of ideas and structures for entrepreneurship. There's certainly more modern books. I happen to like Peter Thiel's book, which I think he calls From Zero to One or something like that. I've forgotten the title. And it talks about entrepreneurship and finding a niche that you can fill and expand into making something big. And then there, of course, if you just start looking as you begin to get specific, there are tons and tons of books on how to structure a business, how to handle the accounting and the finance and so on. But again, I think it starts with changing the belief systems so that you believe you can do it. And for that, there probably is no better book that I've ever read than Think and Grow Rich.
Absolutely.
And Dream Toolbox.
For sure. And just as a final positive note, what would you say you're most grateful for at this point in your life?
Oh, wow. I'm most grateful that I've had the incredible good fortune to have the love of not one but two wonderful women in my life. First, my wife who died a few years ago, and then second, the woman that is now sharing my life. And that's been remarkable. I've also had the good fortune through most of my life of having good health. I've had plenty of health issues that I've had to deal with, but they've been like the puzzles I talked about. You know, okay, I've got a problem. I had a vision problem. I had, other things. And how can we solve them? And so far, they've all been soluble. So I've been very fortunate. As you can see from this ugly photograph on your screen, I'm not a young man anymore. I wake up in the morning thinking I'm at least 20 or 30 years younger than I am until I look in the mirror. So, and that's a good thing because, age ultimately matters because none of us lives forever. But in terms of our capacity to do things, it's how we view ourselves. So that's important.
Absolutely. We can go ahead, wrap things up now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ken. It was absolutely inspiring to hear your story about all the successes you've had over the last couple of years.
Well, I thank you, and of course I didn't tell you about all the failures because they're not as much fun.